So let's start by giving you a sense about where we're going to go tonight and kind of the journey or the path we're going to walk down. So I'll talk a little bit about my background and elaborate here and there on the intro that Dale gave. I'll talk a bit about the world I think we're living in today and the unique challenges that we're facing as a Jewish community, as a civil rights organization, as a country. I'll talk about what I think it means for the communities that we serve at ADL, where our organization is going, and then I'm going to close by sharing with you some of the big bets that I'm making. And I'll talk about what I mean by big bets in a few minutes. So first, a little bit about me. So like I said, I was born at Yale New Haven, and I'm here tonight as the CEO of ADL. But in fact, my story, my ADL story, if you will, goes way back. It goes back in many ways to this photo. So this was a photo that was taken in Germany in the 1930s, in Magdeburg, small town in East Germany. And you can see, I think, the name on top of that beauty parlor, as my grandfather called it, and that's him. That's Bernie Greenblatt. That's my poppy. So this picture was taken before Kristallnacht, when his store was destroyed. This picture was taken before he fled to the United States, escaping on one of the last ships out with a fake passport that said he was not a Jew. This picture was taken before he lost almost his entire family in the Shoah. Now I'm guessing that there are many people in this room who have similar stories. Poppy's story, my story, is a very Jewish story. It's a very Ashkenazi story. And it's a story that I grew up with. But even though my grandfather came to this country without any real money, without any connections, without any language, he was able to carve out a very middle-class life in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm betting some of you have ties to Bridgeport here tonight. And he, despite having, again, seen so much, he always had a sense of hope. He had me and my brother and my cousins marching down Park Avenue in the late 70s in rallies like this to free the Soviet Jews. How many of you, whether it was Park Avenue in Bridgeport, Connecticut, or elsewhere, were involved in the movement to free the Soviet Jews? Raise your hands if you were involved at all. Held up a sign, wrote a letter to your congressman, showed up on Capitol Hill, a few of you. So I got to tell you, I did this. And then something really amazing happened. It worked. Those Jews were freed. They were able to escape the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not so naive, or I wasn't then to think that it was me holding up a sign that did that. But I can tell you as a little boy, this lit something in me. This idea that I could be part of something much bigger than myself. That my Jewish identity connected me to Kol Yisrael, and I could be a part of changing the world. And when you are 7 or 8 years old, those impressions last a lifetime. And that spark that was lit literally put me on the path that I'm on today. It's the reason why when I graduated college, I moved down to Little Rock, Arkansas. This man who at least my parents thought was a unknown governor from a redneck state who wasn't even going to win the Democratic nomination. But I was a work-study student, and he had this idea of kids serving in their communities after they graduated to pay their loans. My dad was self-employed, and he had this idea of health care, which was always challenging our family for all. And he had a muscular policy about intervening in what was going on in Bosnia at the time of genocide. And as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, this really resonated with me. So I went down to Arkansas. Didn't think he would win, but I wanted to fight the good fight. Turned out to be a good decision. But that desire to change the world is what led me to, after business school, leave a comfortable job at a big software company to start my own business, a bottled water company called Ethos Water. Some of you may have heard of it. I co-founded it with my roommate from business school. We ran it out of my house in Los Angeles. The startup life is not as glamorous as you see on Shark Tank, let me tell you. But not only did we make it work, It took a little while, but we were able to grow it to the point where we sold it to one of the greatest brands in the world, Starbucks, and I worked for Howard Schultz, running that business, integrating our company, and at his request, serving on the board of the Starbucks Foundation. Remarkable experience. Later on, I had the chance to start another venture, a technology venture, that I incubated at Google. They invested in it, they gave me engineers, we grew that to a nice size, and then that got acquired. And then I was doing what's known technically as sitting on the beach when I got a call from the guy in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, who had created an Office of Innovation at the White House to focus on accelerating economic recovery, boosting job creation, and he wanted someone who had actually created jobs and economic value to run it. Now, I'll be honest, I was not an Obama person when I got the call. Some of you may love the president, some of you may not like the president, but when you get a call from the Oval Office, you take it. And I deeply believe in serving. And it's kind of why I'm here today. And I'm an unlikely candidate for this job. When I got a call from a recruiter who informed me that Abe Foxman, the longtime head of the ADL, was retiring, my first response was, well, why are you calling me? I'm not a lawyer, I'm an MBA. I've never worked on civil rights issues, I've built businesses. I've never run a nonprofit before, and I have never worked in, nor frankly, at the risk of offending Rabbi Mitch, desired to work in the Jewish community. So am I really the right guy? But now that I've been on the job a little over 2 years, I will tell you that every single day feels like a privilege. Every single day feels like a gift. Because it's a chance again to change the world. And I've worked for investors, and I've worked for shareholders, and I've worked for taxpayers, but I couldn't be prouder to work for the Jewish people. By the way, the toughest audience of them all. So let me tell you where I think the world is today, because that really has a lot to do with where ADL is headed. And this is not the moment in time that I think many had expected we would be in a few years ago. Certainly not. You know, I started my job on July 21st, 2015. 5 days earlier, this man descended down an escalator in the Trump Tower. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that I wasn't an Obama person when I got the call. And I'm going to make a point now that I will come back to again and again and again throughout the course of this talk. I don't really care how you vote. We're a 501c3. But I care deeply about what you value. And I'm going to come back to this issue of values quite frequently over the next 30 minutes. So this picture, let's just say it's not what I would have expected. And I think it's safe to say that in July 2015, I was not alone in thinking that this wasn't likely to happen. But if we try to understand why this happened and why the world is where it is today, I think it starts with another unlikely picture, this picture. Because this is a picture, former Secretary of State John Kerry standing with Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, that few would have imagined possible just a few years ago. And that if you want to try to understand why we are where we are, I would say it starts with that handshake. And it starts with normalizing the Islamic Republic of Iran, the most anti-Semitic government in the world, the largest state sponsor of terror in the world, arguably the most expansionist and militarist government in the world, certainly in the Middle East. And it's this picture, and it's this handshake, and it's this moment, regardless of how you feel about the nuclear deal. We can talk about that if you want. But I would say to you that this is why we have this, an unfettered missile program in Iran, which threatens not only the state of Israel, it threatens Europe, it threatens other allies in the region, and it is Iran's encroaching normalization and our unwillingness to challenge them in an explicit way, which is why the Syrian civil war persisted as it did and was punctuated in a tremendous loss of human life that has destabilized the entire region, and beyond the mortality, spurred the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War, since my grandfather and many of your parents and your grandfathers and grandmothers were refugees. And the cascading effects of those refugees in the Middle East, in Europe, are part of the reason why the European political order as we know it has unraveled. It's part of the reason why the UK literally voted to leave the European Union. It's why Angela Merkel, who won the election a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. She was battered and bruised in that election, and it ushered into power in Germany the AfD, the Alternative for Germany Party, which embraces an extremist, far-rightist agenda. That's right. People are now in the Bundestag who flirt with fascism, something that would have been unspeakable just a few years ago in Germany. And just this weekend in Austria, we had elections where the Freedom Party won, led by a dynamic millennial candidate. For those of you who are not keeping score on European politics, the Freedom Party is a party that was founded by ex-Nazis after the Second World War. And Kurz ran on an explicitly anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim agenda. Oh, and he says he's not anti-Semitic. I will leave that to your own imagination. So we're experiencing a moment in time that just a few years ago would not have been believable. And so the election of Donald Trump as our president here certainly is surprising to many, but in fact is consonant with a moment where the old order seems to be falling apart. And some of the mores and the customs and the practices that we associate with politics also seem to be going by the wayside. Like, for example, not engaging in prejudice. Now, let's be frank. Politicians have always been, I don't know, politicians. But few would imagine that a presidential candidate on the precipice of winning the nomination of a major political party would tweet out an image like this. By way of background, this was pushed out from Donald Trump's Twitter account in July of 2016. This, my friends, let me assure you, is not a sheriff's star. Now, I say that with conviction because we at the ADL track the white supremacist who created this image. And I think we as Jewish people know what it means when you put Jewish stars against money. We know a message that's being communicated. We were baffled by this, hard to really understand. Sure, the David Duke thing a few months before might have been a tell. But it wasn't so much what he was doing, it was the people around him, his supporters. Now, you can't blame this on the candidate. He didn't draw this cartoon. But we saw many, many, many like this all throughout the campaign. And again, if you are a Jewish person and familiar with the kind of propaganda used against our people for thousands of years, let alone the last 100 years since the protocols of the elders of Zion, you know why this is so troubling. And on social media, this has surged. So we track, as I said, at the ADL, extremism of all kinds. And we are very focused on social media. And our analysis of Twitter last summer revealed a shocking amount of anti-Semitism. We pulled 12 months of Twitter data just to try to understand if there was an issue. And let me tell you, there was. And I don't say that anecdotally, I say that empirically. 12 months of Twitter data that we pulled, we found millions and millions and millions of anti-Semitic messages. Tens of thousands of messages directed at a handful of Jewish journalists. You can see what they say about them. The front line in fighting hate is Facebook. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And after the election, we saw images like this. This was taken at a restaurant called Maggiano's. Heard of it? Right up the street, Connecticut Avenue, a couple miles from the White House. The idea of people flagrantly raising their arms in a Hitler salute is something that would have, again, I think, been unthinkable. It's not like in the past there weren't white supremacists. There were. But notice this picture. You've got two white guys and a woman who looks decidedly Asian in the picture. These aren't people meeting with masks on in the dead of night in cornfields in Iowa, right? They're meeting in broad daylight, Instagramming as they go, proud of their position. After the election, we saw a surge of hate crimes. When I say we saw a surge, let me clarify. My 26 offices across the country tracked a tsunami of crimes, acts of vandalism, acts of harassment, acts of violence, directed at Jewish individuals and institutions, and many, many others, just like this. And then in February, after the inauguration, or late January, we saw the White House memorialize Holocaust Remembrance Day by failing to remember the Holocaust. So I say this to you, and we're going to talk more about the president in a few minutes, but these are things that alarm us at the ADL. This is not normal. Oftentimes, again, there could be a moment here or there, a stray comment, an intentional jibe. But I think, again, as a Jewish people, we are genetically encoded with a sense of pattern recognition. And boy, do we see a pattern. It really culminated in many ways in Charlottesville in August with a rally where, again, we had white supremacists, not with hoods on in the cover of night, but in broad daylight, without any sense of accountability, marching for what was intended to be a rally about preserving Confederate statues and Southern heritage. And in fact, there was a great deal of focus on Jews. This was the largest white supremacist rally that had happened in over a decade. And its violence has been widely reported. We all know Heather Heyer, this young woman, was killed when she was run over intentionally by the car driven by a white supremacist. But what wasn't reported on in the news, you may have heard the chants of Jews will not replace us, was how many of these individuals marched up to the synagogue of Charlottesville with those torches, encircled it, and chanted, "Burn it down." Again, in broad daylight. So we're in a moment now where the kind of thing that we have only read about is happening here. And it's really, really troubling. And the mainstreaming and normalization of this extremist ideology is something that I'm going to share tonight, we don't believe is going away. And we've seen an increase in white supremacist recruiting on college campuses. There was an incident today at Gainesville, the University of Florida, which has one of the largest Jewish populations of any university in the country. That's where Richard Spencer went, not an accident. So it's a moment. But I told you earlier that I don't really care how you vote. I care what you value. And to that end, to those of us who consider ourselves progressive, don't get so comfortable. Because neither side of the ideological spectrum is exempt from intolerance. And what we've seen on what I'll call the radical left is equally disturbing. And what we've observed and what we have measured, as we've seen an anti-Semitism tricked up as, anti-Zionism, or just opposition to Israel, how it has infiltrated progressivism is equally troubling. Now this sign says 2015. I use that because I like the graphic. But I can tell you about instances that are happening right now, like at my alma mater. So at Tufts this year, they had one of these votes on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. this campaign to boycott the state of Israel. To achieve a two-state solution? No. To achieve a Palestinian state? No. The intent of the BDS campaign is to eradicate the Jewish state of Israel. Period. Full stop. So they had one of these votes, a BDS vote at Tufts University this past spring, as they've had at places like Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Brown, Michigan, Northwestern, Berkeley, I could go on, UCLA deal. Many fine institutions that we don't think of as hotbeds of anti-Semitism per se, right? But at Tufts University, what distinguished it was when they had the vote this year, when was it scheduled for? Some of you might know. The Students for Justice in Palestine, or the SJP, was able to get the Tufts Student Senate to schedule a special session for this vote, which took place on, close, someone said Yom Kippur? Pardon? Yes, Erev Pesach. So why would you schedule a vote of concern to the Jewish community on Erev Pesach? Yeah, I don't think you need to be like, Sherlock Holmes to figure it out. And what did the administration do about this? Did they delay the vote? No. Nothing. They knew about it. The vote took place. The resolution passed. But Tufts isn't alone. We've seen this narrative start to take hold as if, again, the situation that young boys and men of color in the United States have to deal with has something to do with the complex Arab-Israeli conflict. Again, I don't think you need to be Sherlock Holmes to deduce whether or not that's real. But indeed, there are many in the Black Lives Matter movement who believe that it is. Now, let me tell you something. There's a lot that the Black Lives Matter movement is focused on, like mass incarceration, like literacy levels in the black community, like interaction with law enforcement, that are very legitimate concerns. But this is not. And yet we have the leaders of the Democratic Party who seem for some reason to flirt with these movements. This is Keith Ellison, the vice chairman of the party. This is a speech he gave at an event organized on Capitol Hill by End the Occupation, a BDS supporting organization. And this is not just an issue that a segment of the African American community is focused on. This past summer, we had an incident in Chicago at a Pride March where several LGBTQ Jews were marching with a rainbow flag emblazoned with the Star of David. The Star of David, which has been the symbol of the Jewish people for, I don't know, thousands of years. And when they went to march with this flag, they were asked by several organizers, I'm sorry, are you Zionist? And they said, yes, we are. And the organizers said, get out. Get out. Because this flag makes people feel unsafe. Were there any other flags that they took out of the march? No. Were there any other countries whose national symbols they questioned? No. Now later they apologized, but the damage is already done. And if you want to know where this goes, if you want to know how this story ends, let's look across the pond at England. In the UK, Theresa May is the Prime Minister of the Conservative Party, and if they held elections today, she would lose, and the Labour Party would win. And the new British Prime Minister would be this man, Jeremy Corbyn, who has made no attempt to hide his feelings. He's hailed Hezbollah and Hamas as friends of the British people. He's an avowed supporter of the BDS movement. He's whitewashed investigations into anti-Semitism in his own party. This is the face of the left in Western Europe. Right now in France, there's a trial underway for the brother of the man who murdered 4 Jews in Toulouse. A man of North African descent. He was a jihadist-inspired killer who not only murdered the rabbi, 3 small children in front of the synagogue who were there for day school. And last year I visited Paris. That's a picture taken with my phone. And the Hyper-Caché market, where 4 men were killed by another jihadi-inspired murderer. So whether it is the extreme right, or whether it is the radical left, or whether it is jihadi-inspired Islamists, the threats that we face today are deadly serious. Don't let anyone tell you that, well, I'm not worried about that on the right, only the left concerns me. Or, well, I'm not really worried about the left, it's the right that concerns me. Folks, these are all threats. These are all deadly serious. And if we focus on what we value rather than how we vote, we are compelled to be vigilant in ways that have not been asked of us for generations. So let's talk about how we are trying to be vigilant at the ADL in terms of the communities that we think about. And that starts with the Jewish people. My job description as the CEO of the ADL is pretty simple. It is protect the Jewish people. Now we'll talk about the mission of ADL and how I go about doing that, how I have fidelity to what my forebears set out as the role of this agency. I didn't write the mission statement. Abe Foxman didn't write the mission statement. It was written in 1913. Before I get to that, I want to talk about these different communities in our country today. So let's start with the Jewish people. Look, it's almost Dickensian, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But the fact of the matter is, again, it doesn't really matter to me how you vote. We have a president today who has explicitly embraced the Jewish state like no other country in the world. We have a president today, and I say this not because it's convenient, it's just the facts. Now, I've had the good fortune of spending time with the man in the middle of the picture, Ambassador David Friedman, our ambassador in Jerusalem. Tel Aviv. And I've had a good fortune of spending a lot of time with the man in the right-hand corner, Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. I can tell you that the friendship between Ambassador Friedman and Ambassador Dermer is real. It's not some political contrivance. It's here in the heart. And this president did something that his predecessors hadn't done. He stood at the Kotel, the holiest site to our community, and he prayed. And this is a man who, like it or not, some of you may like it, some of you may not, but the fact of the matter is, he has a Jewish son-in-law, a yeshiva boy, and a Jewish daughter, a Jew by choice, and Jewish grandchildren. They have kasherized one of the kitchens in the White House. We have never, and I will say this loud and clear, we as a community have never had a president of the United States with this intimate a relationship with our people. Never. Ever. Which is why it is such a paradox that on his watch we see this. And he says nothing. 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 Now, is he responsible for this? Of course he's not. Is he responsible for the bomb threats? No, that was an Israeli in Ashkelon. Is he responsible for the cemetery desecrations? Of course he's not. But extremists feel emboldened in an environment where they are not called out. And I am at a loss to explain to you. I am unable to ascertain why the president can find the time to tweet at the cast of Hamilton, or Roseanne Barr, or Meryl Streep, but can't seem to call out David Duke. Honestly, I can't explain it. But there are consequences to the behavior. There is an issue when you create an environment in which these people don't feel like they are repudiated. And indeed, at the ADL, we track hate crimes generally and specifically bias incidences committed against the Jewish community. And what we've saw in just the first half of the year, a 76% increase in the first half of this year versus the first half of last year. Now, it's also true that oftentimes, like a war in the Middle East, and I've talked to the commissioner, the NYPD police commissioner about this, Commissioner O'Neill. There'll be an incident in Israel and boom, there'll be a spurt of swastikas, let's say, on synagogues. Often you see a surge when something happens. But the difference is this isn't a surge. This has been sustained. This isn't a one-time thing. This appears to be, from where we sit, the new normal. And this should frighten you. Now, I'm not just talking about calling a play, a Hitler play, you know? If you're on the football team at Greenwich High School, that's troubling. I'm talking about acts of harassment and vandalism and violence. I'm talking about real stuff, folks. And I've talked to families who've had their homes desecrated. And I've talked to people who've had their children bullied. This is real. But even though the president bafflingly equivocates on these issues, the good news is he's the only one. Just this week, just this morning, President Bush spoke out with clarity, with certitude, with the kind of moral agency which we seem to lack in the West Wing. And if you don't believe me, I would encourage you to go read the transcript of the words he spoke today, where he called white supremacy and bigotry blasphemy against the American creed, among many other powerful words that he shared. And John McCain, 2 days ago, spoke about the fact that this is not a nation forged in blood and soil, a phrase from the Nazi era that's been bandied about by Steve Bannon and others. Yes, that's right. Blood and soil. And in fact, John McCain talked about us being a nation forged on ideals. So even though we're getting mixed signals, you might say, from some, we're getting clarity from others. And that's a powerful thing that gives me a sense of optimism. Now again, we work on issues of civil rights more broadly. African Americans right now are a community with considerable questions. This started before the inauguration, when the president went after John Lewis, who I would describe as an American hero, someone who took the knee, unwillingly as it were, during the 50s and 60s when he fought for civil rights in this country. And there are people taking the knee today. And to be clear, this is not just Colin Kaepernick. That's Jerry Jones in the far end of this picture. So I happen to think you should stand for the national anthem, to be frank. But I also think people have the right to exercise their First Amendment rights, if you will. Not everybody seems to share that view. The LGBTQ community. The Pulse nightclub shooting last year was the worst mass shooting incident in this country until last month. There's a whole other conversation we can have about guns. But you can imagine that this community was on edge. And I know there are people sitting here tonight who are from this community or have family and friends, neighbors and co-workers who know what I'm talking about. And that's why they've been so perplexed and alarmed at a series of decisions coming out of the administration. Frankly, the ban on the transgender troops, after that was announced by the White House, the Pentagon pushed back. So we're getting a series of contradictory messages from inside the administration, messages that are very hard to explain. Women, I'm not going to go into the issues about the history of the candidate on this, but I will point out that the Women's March that happened immediately after the election was the largest, the single largest political demonstration in the history of the United States. How many of you participated here or in Washington? Raise your hands. I must say, I go all over the country. I predominantly speak to Jewish audiences, but not only. And whenever I show this slide, and whenever I talk about this, there are always people, it seems to be in the room, who participated. It was a mass mobilization. It was an inspiring moment. And yet it is baffling why the organizers of the march allowed their ranks to be infiltrated by people who don't believe that we as Jews or Zionists have equal rights, who question whether Zionism and feminism can coexist. And anyone who tells you, look, I'm a feminist, but I'm just an anti-Zionist. Let me be clear. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Plain and simple. Period. End of story. So these are mixed signals. Immigrants, I think I can go out on a limb and say that many of you share my story that I said earlier about my grandfather being a refugee. And I'll go out on another limb. I'm going to guess that every single person in the room here tonight, you came here, you are here as the result of someone who immigrated or came here as a refugee. All of us. Everyone. Unless you came here on a slave ship, or you were part of those who were here before, Native American. We all came here as immigrants. And as George Bush reminded us this morning, it is one of the things that's always made this country so great. Which is why it was so alarming, and one of the first hate crimes of the year that ended in a fatality was the shooting of 2 Indian engineers in Kansas City by a man screaming, "Go back to your country," one of whom, this man, died. And so we spoke out again about this, and we've spoken out about immigrants because we too, we were once strangers. Because all of us know what it is like to live somewhere else. So what does it mean for ADL? Well, let's step back. The ADL was founded in 1913, around the time that this man, Leo Frank, was lynched outside of Atlanta. He was a, quote, Yankee, a Jew from New York who went down south to manage his family's pencil factory. A young Gentile girl was found strangled to death. She had been sexually assaulted on the plant, the premises. Blame instantly was cast toward the Jew. There was a trial that was riddled with anti-Semitism. He was found guilty despite the evidence and sentenced to death. When this man, again, whose trial was a travesty, when the governor commuted his sentence from the death penalty to life imprisonment, the mob was so enraged by that leniency, they tore him from his jail cell and they hung him from a tree. And in that moment, if you will, it catalyzed the creation of the ADL. And the founders of ADL, they wrote a charter. And in that charter, which we have on our wall today in our offices in New York, you can find what we would describe in our kind of modern vocabulary as a mission statement. And I'm not going to read to you what it says on the screen. But what's interesting, if you think about where the Jewish community was in 1913, let me assure you, there were not synagogues like this. Housing covenants, restrictive covenants kept Jews from living in many places. Frankly, I remember growing up in Trumbull and knowing the towns in Fairfield County where we didn't live. And some of you who've been here for 20 or 30 or 40 years, you know what I'm talking about. And I remember the country clubs that didn't let the Jews in here. And again, some of you who've been around the block know what I'm talking about. And there were quotas who kept us out of universities. And there were customs that kept us out of many businesses. And the ADL was founded at a moment when we as a community were politically weak, when we were vulnerable. So what was amazing about that is the founders of ADL said, we will fight for ourselves, but we will also, read it, fight for others. When our community, again, our future here was very uncertain. We didn't have the economic resources in this room tonight. And yet these Jews said, we will fight for ourselves, but we will also fight for others. Because they realized that when America is good for its minorities, it would also be good for its Jewish people. Frankly, that's a very Jewish idea. You all know Hillel. But it was an audacious claim to make at a time when our community didn't really have the wherewithal to do it. But boy, did we ever. Yes, ADL was at the forefront of tearing down those covenants, of breaking open those quotas, of exposing those practices, and making America not a great place for its Jewish people, arguably, save Israel, the greatest place we have ever lived as a people. And ADL also, starting in the 50s, when we filed an amicus brief in Brown v. Board of Education, stepping out on the side of desegregation when it wasn't popular to do. And when we stood with Dr. King in the 50s and 60s, when it wasn't popular to do. And when we stood for immigrants in that same decade. And I could go on with all the work that ADL's accomplished on the civil rights front. But we've been doing this work for decades. Because again, our mission compels us to seek justice and fair treatment to all, not only to us. So how do we get that work done? 4 things. Number 1, we work on hate crimes. We track them, we investigate them. We do advocacy. We try to change laws through the courts and through Congress. Or through state houses, like here in Connecticut, where you now have one of the toughest hate crimes laws in the country, thanks to Steve Ginsburg and the work of many of our leadership here at ADL. Number 3, we do education. Look, long ago we realized you can't arrest or litigate your way to stopping hate. You got to change hearts and minds. Today, the ADL is one of the largest providers in the United States of anti-bias, anti-bullying, anti-hate content in schools. The ADL touches over 1.5 million children every year, all over America. And lastly, we work with law enforcement, not only to investigate those hate crimes, although we do that. We train them in how to deal with hate and hate crimes. We train them and educate them on extremism. The ADL is the largest trainer of law enforcement on these issues in the United States. We train more than 15,000 officers every year. The FBI has made our training mandatory. The New York Police Department has made our training mandatory. Many big cities use ADL. So that's what we do. Now the question becomes, in light of this operating environment, in light of the challenges I've laid out for you tonight, what are we doing? And I would say to you, we are making big bets. So what do I mean by a big bet? I mean, for example, the idea that a computer manufacturer 12 plus years ago could decide it was going to get into the phone business. That seemed like a crazy idea when Steve Jobs dreamt it up. You can go read Walter Isaacson's book. He describes it in great detail. It was a big bet for Steve Jobs, and it was a big bet that transformed Apple from a niche hardware manufacturer to the most valuable company on the planet. That's what a big bet is. It's a transformative decision that reinvents your organization. So here's where ADL is going. Number 1, we're making a big bet on cyber. As I said before, the front line in fighting hate is on Facebook. How many of you used Google or Facebook, not in the last 15 minutes since I started talking, but let's say in the last 24 hours, raise your hands. Okay, who didn't raise their hand? I want to meet that person. Social media has spread to every corner of our lives. It is how we shop, it is how we socialize, it is how we search for information today. And so we shouldn't be surprised that extremists have tried to exploit it with great effectiveness. Look, Facebook alone. Facebook has more than 2 billion members. That is larger than any country on the planet by a large degree. 2 billion members. More than 1 billion of them are active every month. And I have heard reports, though Facebook hasn't confirmed it, that there are upwards of 5 billion messages exchanged on the platform every single day. 5 billion messages. So that's text, that's audio, that's video, those are emojis in different languages, right? Different scripts. It is impossible to imagine that any one company could track that effectively with CSRs, or customer service representatives, which is why, as we tackle cyber, we're now implementing AI and working with some of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to neutralize online harassment before it happens. Last week, we announced a new initiative with the support of Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft. We've created something called the Problem Solving Lab. Now, previously, our work with Silicon Valley has been very focused on the lawyers, with good reason. We're an organization, as I said in the beginning, filled with lawyers, but I'm not a lawyer. In fact, I'm a former product guy from Silicon Valley. And I can tell you that the way we will fix this problem will not be with briefs, and it won't be with memos. It will be with technology and innovation. So the lab is convening engineers and product people from these different companies to develop shared strategies to tackle this threat, because they all face it. They all have to deal with it. As they dealt with copyright violations or child pornography, they all know they now need to deal with this. And next month, we are opening our first office in Silicon Valley. An office that was enabled by a seed investment from Pierre Omidyar. Does anyone here know who Pierre Omidyar is? Who's Pierre Omidyar? eBay, the founder of eBay. An Iranian American, not Jewish, but who is deeply concerned about the spread of fake news and the explosion in cyber hate, and sees ADL as the leading actor in trying to tackle these challenges. So the ADL is making a big bet on cyber. Number two, we are making a big bet on the fight against extremism. Right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism. I don't even like to use the whole right and left paradigm anymore because they don't apply. If anything, you see the right and the left, it's not a 180-degree line, it's more like a 355-degree line because they converge at the edges. The hostility and anti-Semitism you see from elements of the radical left who delegitimize the state of Israel is interestingly not that dissimilar from the hateful rhetoric you see from the extreme right who delegitimize Jews. These people say, well, I like Jews, it's just the Jewish state I have a problem with. These people say, I like the Jewish state, it's just globalists I have a problem with. Two peas in a pod. So how are we making a big bet on extremism? Well, the ADL Center on Extremism has been working to combat this since the 1930s, when J. Edgar Hoover reached out to the ADL to get help dealing with Nazi sympathizers in the US. That's a story for another day. We just recruited out of the administration a young man by the name of George Salim, a former AmeriCorps member, an intelligence officer in the Navy Reserves, who spent 12 years hired by Michael Chertoff, DHS Secretary under George Bush, and then he served under Obama, and then he served under Trump, where he reported directly to DHS Secretary John Kelly before John Kelly was brought up to the White House. George designed and implemented the administration's strategy on combating violent extremism. That's what he did. Combating right-wing extremism, combating radical jihadi extremism. George Salim is an Arab-American Christian who's going to take our work against extremism to the next level. And so how is that happening? Well, I can tell you from the left, if you will, we just launched a new initiative to fight BDS on campus, our Think, Plan, Act program. We're distributing through partnerships with Hillel and Jewish fraternities to empower our young people to respond to anti-Israel activity when it happens. And secondly, on the far right, we were on the ground at Gainesville today, monitoring Richard Spencer. We have amped up the work that we are doing to combat right-wing extremists, and there's more on that I'll be able to share soon. Lastly, our last big bet beyond cyber and extremism is inclusivity. I will not surrender the center or the left to the radicals. Forget it. I won't do it. Because my mission compels me to seek justice and fair treatment to all. So we're making a big bet. And in the face of rallies like Charlottesville, we're responding in new ways. Because like I said, even if the commander-in-chief seems to equivocate, there's been unequivocal denunciations from others. So we partnered with the U.S. Conference of Mayors to create something called the Mayor's Compact. We basically reached out to mayors and said, we can help you prepare proactively before you have a rally like Charlottesville. We can help you to inoculate your community from intolerance. We developed a 10-point plan that mayors could adopt to prepare. How many mayors have signed up? We have about 315 mayors to date who have now joined the Mayor's Compact. Republicans and Democrats, red states and blue states, big cities and small towns. The ADL is engaging with city halls across the United States to combat hate. We were contacted by the NFL when this broke out to get help, to give them advice. And again, I believe you should stand for our national anthem and honor it. But the fact of the matter is, I think sports shouldn't be used to divide our country. I think it can be used to unite us. So the ADL created, with the help of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Billie Jean King, and Ronnie Lott from the 49ers, the Sports Leadership Council. It's chaired by Larry Scott, the commissioner of the Pac-12 division of the NCAA. And we are going to work with the leagues, with teams, with colleges, and with high schools to use sports as a strategy to bring our kids and our communities together. And I think there's a considerable amount we can do on the field, in the locker room, and off the court to use sports, again, to bring us together rather than to divide us. So how can you do this? How can you be involved? Well, I'll tell you, there are things you can do. You can help us with the investigating hate crimes. You can speak up when something happens in your community. You can get involved in the advocacy work, which again changes laws, like right here in Connecticut. You can get engaged in schools. And then lastly, you can help us with the work we do with law enforcement, to train them and to support them in the work that they do. But I'll just say my ADL story, like I said, started here. And so here it is that I will end it tonight. And I will end it tonight by sharing one last story. So when I was a kid in high school, I had to do a project like many of you probably did, or maybe your kids have done. I had to interview a family member. I interviewed him, my grandfather. And I asked him, among many other questions, I said, you know, Poppy, when you were a young man, did you ever imagine that your grandson, me, would be born and raised here in America? And my grandfather said, with his thick German accent, which I'm not going to try to do, he said something like, ugh, no, I never thought about these things. But if I did, I thought, of course, you're in Germany, maybe Austria, probably Germany. And then my grandfather said, where else would we go? Where else would we go? That's what he said. Because my great-grandfather had fought in the First World War. Germany was their homeland. It was the only country they ever knew. And so he said, where else would we go? Fast forward 10 years, and I get married, and my wife Marjan, came to this country as a political refugee from Iran, or as my parents from Bridgeport call it, Iran. And I asked my wife, frankly, I asked my father-in-law, who came to this country in his 40s. He and my wife and his, it's a long, complicated tale, but they also snuck out with fake passports. They also escaped their homeland. I asked him, Mansour Khan, that's what I call him, Mansour Khan, when you were a young man growing up in Iran, did you ever imagine that your grandchildren, my kids, would be born and raised here in America? And Mansour Khan says to me in his thick Iranian accent, which I also won't try to do, he says, no, I didn't think about these things. If I did, I mean Iran, of course. Then he says, maybe Iraq. Way back when, Iraq and Iran were very close. But then he finalizes his answer with, but you know, Iran, of course, because where else would we go? My father-in-law, a political refugee from Iran, because he was a Jew, says the same thing that my grandfather, if you will, a refugee from Germany, who escaped because he was a Jew. Their lives, in some ways, couldn't be more different, and yet they have the very same answer. Where else would we go? Well, you know what? I think about where my grandchildren will be born and raised. And unlike them, I'm still, I think, a young man, and I think about it a lot. And I want my grandchildren to be born and raised right here in America, and I want them to be as Jewish as they want to be. And I won't tolerate for a second the idea that they have to leave this place. That's why I took this job at ADL, and that's why I think this fight matters more than ever.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.